Hey everyone, Mike Brasher here, your co-host of the DU podcast. This is just a quick reminder that the episode you were about to hear was recorded prior to the coronavirus. Today we have an episode, the first in a three-part series, where we sat down with Jerry Holden to discuss all the important conservation and fundraising work that we are doing in Ducks Unlimited's southern region. Noticeably absent from that conversation, of course, will be any mention of the coronavirus. And so just keep in mind, this was recorded prior to that. Still a lot of great information, so we wanted to continue to bring this message to you nonetheless. We'll try to have Jerry on again sometime in the future to give us an update on all of this great work. In the meantime, we thank you again for listening and for all your support in these most unprecedented times. So, here's your episode. Enjoy.
Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America, we bring the resource to you. The DU Podcast with your host, Dr. Mike Brasher.
Thanks for joining us again here on the podcast. On this episode, we have a guest in studio. We're welcoming in Jerry Holden, our Director of Operations from the Southern Region. That's one of the neat things about having all of our little studio, if you call it that, here at headquarters, is that a lot of times we get some visitors from across the organization and even outside the organization, and we have an opportunity to pull them in and just sort of off the cuff have a conversation with them about something. So, Jerry, thanks for taking time out of your schedule here to spend a few minutes with us.
Yeah, I'm super excited to be here.
We'll start off here just talking generally about a number of things. You've been on some podcasts before. We'll get to a conversation about the southern region, some of the conservation efforts that are underway there and our priorities within the region. But I think we just want to take some time to talk one to another. You used to actually be my supervisor whenever my position was run out of the southern region. And so it's kind of neat to sort of have this conversation with you. So we'll start out just with, we're going to start out with a few questions. You weren't aware of this, so I'm kind of springing this on you. So yesterday when I kind of knew we were going to have you here, I sent an email to some of our comrades and said, here's your opportunity to ask Jerry some questions. So the first question I have comes from, it's kind of like a Q&A with Jerry Holden. First question comes from Tom Mormon. He says, why does our miniature schnauzer love everyone but seems to think Jerry Holden is Darth Vader? What's the story behind that?
So the miniature schnauzer's name is Mowgli, and I actually don't know the answer to that. But that dog barks at me incessantly and frenetically unless I touch it. If I touch him, he chills out.
So the real question is, why does Tom Mormon, our chief scientist, have a miniature schnauzer? Is that fair?
The answer is because Tom Mormon is married.
Okay. Well, there we go. So, Jerry, you, as I've mentioned to you, have a pretty interesting story of how you came to Ducks Unlimited. So, and we all have our stories of how we got into this field, how we were first attracted to the natural resources and the path that took us to a career in natural resource conservation and management. So there's an opportunity to just hear about yours. I know you grew up in Kansas. So just take us through that. What was your childhood like? What were your experiences as a child that exposed you to the outdoors, and where did we go from there?
So I was raised in a family that was associated with the United States Army. And my dad, super grateful to him. He wasn't raised in a family that waterfowl hunted. And so he figured it out, and he took his firstborn son, me, and somewhere about the time I was 11 or so, I shot my first mallard on a Kansas Department of Wildlife and Fisheries property that became a DU project later. We locally know it as the Beaver Ponds. I won't tell you any more about it. I don't want anybody else hunting there, but shot that duck and something happened. And in that, I bonded with my dad in some complicated ways, and it was became a place where we could spend time together. It became the most important thing in my life, was sort of suffering through school in order to get to some consumptive arena, most especially and favorably waterfowl. And so I went to school, high school like everybody else, and I wanted to have a conservation job. And the only one that I knew existed was a game warden. And so as you will do in the days before the internet, you call or you figure out what's a game warden get paid. And the answer was $16,100 a year. I remember this because it shocked me. Even then, that would have been about 1985. And I was like, wow. And so I gave up my dream of working in conservation in that moment, and went to school. That didn't go so well, despite having been a really good high school student. That didn't go so well. So I was working for Walmart and was really successful in getting promoted within Walmart. Turns out that I had a knack for personnel management, conflict resolution, merchandising, the things it takes to make a Walmart store run, and did that for a number of years and really enjoyed it. Moved all over the place, set a bunch of new stores in places that I now travel to. And one day in 93, I was thinking about how unsatisfied I was with just doing a job that made money, and that I really wanted to work in conservation. It'd been a truth, just a truth that I had chosen to ignore for a little while. And so I retired because I had 7 years in. I retired and took my profit sharing stock and liquidated everything, bought myself a new truck, put the rest in the bank, and paid for myself to go back to school. I vividly remember driving to see the dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, wearing my best double-breasted suit, as was the fashion in the day, and begging to get back into school at a 1.1 GPA. I remember Dean Fireharm saying, "I can't let you back into school. You're obviously, incapable of success here." And I said, "Sir, if you just give me a chance, I'll get into grad school," because by then I'd had time to figure out what it took to have a conservation career. And he said, "I doubt it, but okay." And he let me into school, and I was able to do it. I was able, by getting straight A's through all of undergrad, I was able to get into graduate school. So I was training dogs, and then I went to work in North Dakota for the Department of Defense for the United States Air Force, 319 Civil Engineering Squadron out of Grand Forks, North Dakota. And then I just happened to see a job open at Ducks Unlimited, Southern Region. Dr. Tom Moorman, who at the time was a conservation planner for that region back in the late 90s, really thought that he needed to understand the spatial distribution and frequency of waterfowl habitat in some key landscapes. And DU had an idea of how to do that because we'd done some of the stuff in Alaska. And so we had some idea, but this was different. This was mostly understanding water. In some ways, sort of derivative processes that still go on today.
Was that one of the first applications of that satellite imagery? Probably was within our organization. Like you said, it's now kind of old hat. We do it every year all over the landscape, but that was probably one of the first times that had been applied.
Turns out when we were in Long Grove, Illinois, some really smart people had figured out that satellites were really handy for waterfowl habitat. It just hadn't been applied. It was applied more in a mapping sense, to get a sense of what was out there. Whereas the thing that we worked on was much of the temporal aspects of how much is out there and how often is it out there and what's in it for the duck. Yeah. So Tom Moorman had that idea. And so one of the ways I want you to think about it is that satellites become the sensory organs for our conservation planners, right? They help them see in ways that they can't otherwise see, and understand things at scale that they couldn't have otherwise understood. And aircraft can do some of that, but then you have to do it in a way that you can make statistical inferences about that. And the satellite has some advantages and some disadvantages. And so then I came to work doing that. And then the rest of my DU career has just progressed in a series of progressively responsible administrative jobs to today. I run the Southern Region for Ducks Unlimited.
You've worked in Jackson, the Mississippi Alluvial Valley. You also spent some time on the Gulf Coast, right? So you're familiar with that, intimately familiar with that landscape of Louisiana and Texas. And have you resided in any other location in the Southern Region during your time with DU?
No, not during my time for DU. So I've only lived in Jackson, Mississippi, Monroe, Louisiana, Lafayette, Louisiana, and then back to Jackson, Mississippi.
And so now you are the director of the Southern Region. You've been in that position for 2.5 years, something around there.
3 years, yeah.
Very good to have you in that position. By all accounts, I hear things are going quite well there. So kudos.
That's right. Things are going great. The business of Ducks Unlimited in the South is in a great place. But I think it's useful that we ground ourselves and realize that the $45 million worth of business that the Southern Region does today is about one really good sized Walmart, that's about how much business it does.
Puts it into perspective, doesn't it?
Rather starkly for me, right? Though we strive so hard, we still struggle with a conservation footprint and fiscal resources that allow us to respond to the threats that we deal with every day.
It's almost a scale issue. You kind of have to, for perspective, scaling what our annual revenue is within a given region relative to some other factor. We kind of did this with Scott Stevens on a recent episode where we talked about the amount of land holdings that DU Canada has, and it, on the surface it sounds like a lot, but whenever you scale it up against the 100+ million acres of cropland and ranch land in Prairie Canada alone, you're like, holy cow! It just emphasizes the importance of. Or it emphasizes the scale of the challenges that we face and why it's really, why the work that we do is, well, it's laudable, it's rewarding, and it's challenging.
We're the ideological descendants of some really visionary people that thought that you could source private capital and inject it, if you injected it just right, into the ecological bottlenecks for the birds on the landscape, that you could make a population difference. And turns out they were right. What they meant, they thought that $5 million would do it. In their foundational meetings, right? We know this. Well, that wasn't the case because they missed this important fact. When DU was founded, there was 125 million Americans. If we looked it up now, it'd be 329 million Americans. And those 329 million Americans haven't held their standard of living steady. So they require more resources per family. And what that does is it creates significant headwinds for wild things in wild places and Ducks Unlimited's mission.
Be the first to know when ducks are on the move. Sign up for DU's waterfowl migration email alerts and receive ongoing in-depth updates on the latest habitat conditions, weather changes, and hunting reports for your flyway. Visit ducks.org/migration alerts.
I want to shift gears here a little bit to talk about personal experiences here this year. That we're recording this in February 2020, and so I just want to reflect on your hunting season. We can have a Q&A here. I think both you and I took a trip to Canada, separate trips to Canada. We tried to do that occasionally. We also had some limited experiences hunting in the South this year. But so just starting out, what would your experiences like this year? I know you had some challenges personally with respect to access to hunting locations.
Yeah, so we started the year in taking a trip to Saskatchewan, and I've been hunting the same part of Saskatchewan. I think it's 8 seasons and going about to the same places, and it's been getting progressively drier. And this year, because of some work commitments, I had to slide the trip back to earlier in September, and so the harvest had just barely ensued. And so we had a combination of a lot of dry wetland basins and a lot of fields. Almost all the fields were standing in grain. And so it was a significant challenge to be able to hunt waterfowl. We were pretty darn successful given the factors that we faced. But I've had better trips if you measure it by harvest. But at 52 years old tomorrow, I'm in a place where it's the experience and the people I spend it with is a little more important than how many dead birds I put on the ground. And
that's similar to our experience. I went to Canada with some friends and colleagues and coworkers, and we went to actually southern Manitoba. We went, I believe it was the second week of October, and we tried to hunt Delta Marsh there, and there weren't a great number of birds around, but this is also an example of where the experience was far more rewarding and memorable than the actual number of ducks that we bagged, that we harvested, because if folks will remember, in October of 2019, they had this massive snowstorm come through the prairies, and one of the epicenters, at least the epicenter for some of the strong winds, was right there at the southern end of Lake Manitoba where we were. And the short version of that story is that if it weren't for gadwall, we probably our harvest would have been cut in half. So we went to Manitoba and shot gadwalls. The other part was that we ended up being without power for like 2 days. Thankfully, the place where we were staying had propane, had a propane tank outside, so we were able to We were able to heat the place. We were able to cook. And then fortunately, the caretaker there saved us and saved the building by bringing a small generator to run the sump pump, because when the power goes out, the sump pumps don't work. And in that kind of a landscape, the water starts coming up through the basement. So the memories are rich from that trip.
You almost had a Donner Party experience. It was this close.
It was something. Yeah. One of those experiences that you're glad you made it through, but you don't really look to repeat it. And so then coming back south here, I live in Memphis now. I grew up in North Mississippi, as listeners of the show will know by now. I talk about that often, reference it often. And I had an opportunity to go back to some of my old stomping grounds and try to hunt a little, and just didn't do very well there. Actually ended up being way more successful in the big game this year. Ended up killing 4 deer, and so that filled the freezer, and killed a few ducks while we were at it. But yeah, otherwise a challenging year, but that's okay. You know, you have some good years, you have some bad years.
And so the next thing I did duck season wise was hunt in Kansas when I went home to see my family across Thanksgiving. And I assume it's entered the American consciousness to some degree. But we had a rather historic flood for most of 2019 in the Mississippi River and its tributaries. And well, that happens to be where I went to go hunt. And we had abysmal habitat conditions. It can't get any worse. Right? Just water and mud. The vegetation used to be a plant, and now it was in a state of decay, and there wasn't much there for ducks. Yet we were able to kill. We had a couple of pretty nice mallard shoots. Makes you pull out all the tricks in the bag that you know as a waterfowler to get that stuff to work. And the best part was I got to hunt with my best friend. We met when we were in 5th grade, and then my son, who will be 14 next month, and my nephew, who is 14. So we got to take the kids hunting and had a couple of good hunts. And the rest of the hunts we made were not good, as in not worth mentioning. But we also had some ice conditions, which is adds a little flavor to that whole experience. But we got to take the kids out. We killed a few ducks. It was pretty good.
Now I'm going to ask you a question that, as a scientist, it's a question I hate the most, because whenever somebody asks me a question, I want to be able to back it up with a good amount of data. Well, this is the type of question in which to get good, reliable data is almost impossible. So, but nevertheless, we're in this field. You and I both work for Ducks Unlimited. Hunters are some of our strongest constituents and supporters, and we interact with them often. So the question to you is, based on the folks that you interacted with and that you heard from, what's your overall sense of hunting success across the southern region this year? And I shouldn't say hunting success, because that kind of frames the answer, but just hunting conditions, bird numbers, hunting success. Let's just throw all those in there together.
So the southern region is when you think longitudinally, is a really big place. The western edge is the western edge of New Mexico, and the eastern edge is over in Virginia, right? So that's a really large
area in between there.
So there's a lot of answers to that. I do travel a lot. I do talk to a lot of our constituents, and it's my sense that Texas had a pretty solid season. The playas, which are in the northwestern part of Texas and parts of New Mexico and Kansas, were pretty historically wet. That doesn't happen but 1 year. 2 years and 7, something on the order of that. When they get wet, birds tend to respond to those landscapes. There's not very many hunters there, which actually adds to their success, because they have less competition for the primo spots to do that. But it looks to me like Texas, in all of its landscapes, had a pretty good duck season. Whether it's the oaks and prairies in the middle of Texas or along the coast, it seems as though the central flyway part of the southern region really, really had a nice season. I would say about as good as it's going to get. As you move east into Louisiana and Arkansas, it seems more spotty, more discontiguous. People's satisfaction. You talk to somebody and they're loving it, and you talk to somebody else and it's awful. And I can't really explain that. Some of that has to do with the changing. People tend to hunt the places that they've always hunted, and birds, they move around. They don't always go the same places. And then that makes people say things like the flyway moved. You and I'll hear that a lot. Maybe not, maybe so, right? Yeah. People's perspective extends only as far as they can see, which is only a few miles when they're in the duck blind. And then As you move further east into the region across and past the Mississippi Valley into the South Atlantic, there it seems I think the expectation framework is different. Arkansas, Louisiana, Texas hunters have an expectation of a bounty of birds. And as you move to the east, it's less so. And so they tend to be more satisfied with just another duck season. And so I haven't heard a lot of complaints from that sector, which could be because they killed a lot of birds or because their expectations are different.
Yeah, it's very difficult to know how to read and interpret the information that you're getting. Every year there are going to be some people that have a very, very poor duck season. You're going to hear from those people. A lot of times it's the folks that are experiencing the least amount of success that naturally are most frustrated, and they're the ones that we hear from. It's just the same thing in any aspect of our lives. We have a tendency, more times than not, I think, to express our frustration than we do to express our pleasure. Our satisfaction with it. It doesn't matter if we're eating at a restaurant. How many times have you called the waiter back or the server back to talk about, how great the meal was? Go out of your way to talk about how great the meal was. There inherently is some sort of bias towards those that are most frustrated with a certain outcome. So as a scientist, that's why I say that's one of the worst questions possible you can ask if I'm going to try to use information that I'm getting from people that I'm hearing voluntarily, is because I know that's more than likely a biased sample that's not reflective of everybody. The people that are doing really well are kind of keeping their mouth closed and not sharing some of their success sometimes. But you are right. We have heard some of the comments and some of the frustrations. Don't mean to dismiss any of the observations of folks in certain parts of throughout the country that are. And they have legitimate questions about, hey, what are we seeing? And those are questions that are of interest to us as scientists and biologists as well. And I can, as we've shared on past episodes, those questions are getting asked throughout the flyways. I was in the Central Flyway last week talking with some of their biologists, and to hear them go around the table and talk about what they saw, what they heard from their hunters and from their survey numbers, it kind of makes you scratch your head and say, well, where are all the ducks? As the question goes. And I think ducks are just very remarkable at taking advantage of habitats and avoiding disturbance, trying to avoid us that are trying to kill them.
We talked about my history when we started this, and one of the things that Sam Walton said that's drilled into my brain is that if you make somebody happy, they won't tell anyone. If you make somebody mad, they'll tell 10 people.
Yeah.
Just underlines what you said earlier. And one of the things I think is worth talking about in terms of hunter success is the conversation I've had with Arkansas hunters is, hey, we saw lots of birds.
Yeah.
Stark contrast to last year. We saw lots of birds, but boy, we really had trouble getting them to work, right? They were decoy shy, call shy in the first 2 weeks of the season. And so, as one of DU's experts on this subject, what can you tell us and the audience about why we would happen to have a year where we saw lots of ducks, but boy, they were very uncooperative?
I actually experienced that in Arkansas. I had the pleasure of hunting with some friends in Arkansas, and we did see a lot of ducks, and it was exactly that. They would look at the decoys and they would swing by a few times, and you think they're going to commit, but they just never would. And I even saw it in Mississippi as well when I hunted there the last week or next to the last week of the season. And to me, that's a telltale sign of at least one of two things, if not both. Yeah, number one, those birds have been in the area for a while, and weather conditions were not such that weather conditions were mild. They didn't have to forage as much for thermal regulatory purposes. The colder it is, the more they have to eat in order to sustain a given body mass, body condition. And in order to find food, they have to move around. They can't just, resources in a given area are finite, so they have to move around to find additional resources. So that's one thing. We're dealing with a mild winter. That's going to kind of reduce the amount of time they have to forage. So it could have been there for a while, mild conditions. But then the other thing that I think plays a role is, and increasingly we're able to sort of show this with some data comparisons, is the age ratio in the population, number of young birds in the population. Our snow goose hunters will be able to speak to this firsthand better than anyone, is that when you have a lot of adults, when you have few juveniles in the population, your success is going to be down. You're going to be way challenged to have good success chasing snow geese. We had Drew Fowler on earlier, one of the first episodes in the podcast, and he talked about that, and how a lot of the snow geese that we harvest, even in the spring, are in poorer condition. Even if they're adults, they're among the poorer conditioned birds. But yeah, overwhelmingly your success in that case is going to be tied to the number of juveniles in the population. And so we've had a couple of dry years on the prairies, and I think that's increasingly we just need to do a better job communicating our understanding of how these numerous factors, there's no single factor that is driving this. There are at least half a dozen very strong factors that we can point to that are controlling or helping to control what birds are doing, at a local scale as well as at a larger landscape scale. And it's, again, as a scientist, you want to be able to provide the precise answer, but when you're dealing with the population of birds, the type of bird that migrates across such vast landscapes, there are invariably a number of factors that are influencing what those animals do. So exciting but challenging, like a lot of things in our field.
So I've been hunting in Mississippi for, I guess I started, the 99-2000 season was the first year. And I've hunted in Mississippi most of the years between there. And one of the things I've seen is specklebellies or white-fronted geese becoming more a part of the bag and more part of the sport. And they're, for me personally, super exciting birds to hunt. That took me probably 3 years to even be adequate at calling them. And so sometimes the changes in distribution of waterfowl are favorable, and sometimes they're not.
Depends on where you are. I think I've heard our chief scientist say, anytime you talk about changes in distributions of birds, whether it be migratory waterfowl or some other group of migratory birds that are hunted or whatever the case may be, there are going to be winners and there are going to be losers. What we've seen with greater snow geese moving from historically their numbers being most strong down on the Texas coast, eastward into Louisiana, and then northward into the Mississippi alluvial valley, it tracks very well the shift in rice agriculture that we've seen across that landscape. That much is for sure. But the white fronts are doing well as a population, and increasingly I hear them flying over our house in western Tennessee, and it's like, my goodness, this is kind of exciting. Jerry, you and I could probably continue a conversation about duck hunting and dog training and whatever the case may be for quite some time, but this is probably a natural place to bring this episode to a close. I know we still have material or a lot of things to cover on the southern region from a conservation priority standpoint, conservation challenges standpoint, and also just want to talk about some of what you find most rewarding working in the southern region, working with Ducks Unlimited in general, and all of our volunteers and supporters. So that's we're going to end this particular episode here, and so folks can tune in sometime in the future to catch the other episode that we'll record. So Jerry, thanks for your time.
Glad to be here.
Special thanks to our guest on today's show, Jerry Holden, Director of Operations for Ducks Unlimited Southern Region. We certainly appreciate him taking the time to sit down with us here in studio and discuss a range of topics. As always, we thank our producer, Clay Baird, for the great job that he does in getting the podcast edited and out to you. And also, the most important part of this venture is you, the listener. We thank you for your time and spending it with us. And we, most importantly, thank you for your support, passion, and commitment to wetlands and waterfowl conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show, and visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the Ducks.